like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm well. Thanks for hosting me.
Yeah, man. It's been a while since you and I have recorded, at least on my show. It seems like we've spent a lot of time talking, both in person in Portland, and then with a number of other recordings. But nonetheless, happy to be back. So we're going to continue our deep dive into Richard Ramirez. This is your area of expertise, so I'll just let you go.
Yeah, there's some interesting things in the zeitgeist. I mean, some of which I covered in the first episode. Obviously matters relating to spiritual warfare and things, and an atavistic resurgence of genuinely pagan belief structures. Okay, I mean I think that goes without saying. I know some people view the metaphysical aspect of these things as mumbo jumbo, but the perception was what I said it was, even if people don't accept the, any kind of supernatural aspect to it. But there was something else that was underway. I look at Ramirez as obviously his rampage was particularly horrible. It was especially punctuated. It was particularly disruptive of people's lives and of, Los Angeles, the day-to-day of LA culture as it stood, in 1980-45. But also it was part of this pastiche of violent events, really the preceding 15 years, that I think had a common nexus of causation. First and foremost among those things would be the Zodiac murders, which I don't want to spin off into a discussion of that. I mean, we can in a later episode if you and the subs want to. I think it'd be worth discussing. But among other things, the Zodiac was very much, occult motivated in terms of his worldview. There was a particularly horrible, overtly racially motivated murder spree by this subset of the Nation of Islam. This is probably faded.
Was this the zebra murders or
the zebra murders? And there was this faction of the Nation of Islam. They call themselves 5%ers, loosely, and like Big D hit me to the lure of all this stuff. Okay. The 5%ers, the reason why it shows that branding is they said that they're the 5% of black men who are truly enlightened. And they had this apocalyptic understanding of race war. And they basically viewed their mission as to kill as many white people as possible, as some kind of catalyzing element. And then the reaction from law enforcement and from white society will lead to this kind of general uprising of colored people, and blacks being, the first man and being thus chosen to, lead the First Nations against the oppressor will become this, leadership cadre, whose mandate has been sanctified in blood and the sacrifice of the white devil. Okay, now to be clear, like, mainstream NOI guys don't think this way. Like, whatever their eccentricities are, like, I know NOI guys who I got respect for. They're not. I mean, and they're strongly racially coded, like I am, but they don't want to go out and murder white people or something. I want that to be clear. These guys absolutely did want to do that, and they did do that. And this this caused genuine terror in the Bay Area. And they killed, I think they murdered 15 people. 8 of their victims survived. One poor lady was paralyzed. A lot of their victims were raped. One woman was practically decapitated with a machete. It's more horrible than even the most lurid imaginings, okay? And this was going on at the same time as the Zodiac's rampage, and a lot of non-state actor violence, some of which was funded by the Warsaw Pact. I mean, this was a mess, okay? So San Francisco PD was doing everything they could to suppress knowledge of what was underway. But when one of these guys turned state's evidence because he realized he was in too deep, and apparently he had something of a conscience, 4 of his rappies got arrested. A couple of them ended up on death row. A couple others ended up serving life without parole. But as he explicated what the ideology was of this particular cell, who called themselves the Death Angels, it was like something from the darkest Africa. Okay, I'm not being funny or punitive. I mean, this was some savage shit, of the sort that you wouldn't think would be possible in the 1970s in modern society. To be clear, it was there's something atavistic and primitive and totally sanguinary about it. It wasn't just guys saying, okay, we want to pursue a tension strategy to cause a race war. Let's kill white people. It was primitive in its coding. But this caused a lot of, to bring it back, this shattered a lot of assumptions about what motivates people to murder strangers. And obviously this was also, all these things were happening at the same time as the serial murder epidemic and the violence epidemic. Excuse me. I'm having a little bit of respiratory issues, so forgive me for coughing. But really from the post World War II era until the mid to late 80s, what was the majority consensus, or what was the academic and medical consensus on a stranger homicide and serial murder? It derived from the research of the psychiatrist named Hervey Cleckley. He wrote a book that was first published in 1941 called The Mask of Sanity. I've always found that to be a poignant title. It's an interesting book, but the title is way more evocative than the actual substance. But that was kind of the seminal clinical description of psychopathy in the 20th century. And the basic description that Cleckley presented is that a psychopathic person, outwardly, he's a perfect mimic of a normally functioning human. Generally he has a job. He's presented as well as anybody else. But this is literally a mask that hides an internal chaos because his inner life is totally fractured. And despite him seeming to be an integrated and even intelligent or charming person, all he's doing is mimicking what he sees those around him doing in an affected capacity. And if one were to penetrate the subconscious and the inner life of one such subject, they'd realize that there's nothing there. There's some sort of animal instinct and insatiable appetite for violence, usually sexually coded and sexually sadistic violence, but there isn't even a true human personality there. It's some sort of cunning intelligence that serves what amounts to a sort of biological engine of violent impulses and a constant need for hedonic gratification. which is pretty frightening, and I don't think that that's totally inaccurate. But, this conceptualization very much, this very much became somewhat discredited when the violence epidemic kicked off. Because if for no other reason, a lot of these people who are doing extremely violent things and targeting strangers, they didn't fit this description, or they didn't fit this diagnostic criteria. And that includes Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez lacked a conscience. There was something utterly warped about his inner life, but he did in fact possess all the characteristics of a modular mind and personality, and this is one of the things that really conflicted with Cleckley's model. Cleckley attacks the modularity and the faculty psychology view of mind, as well as Freudianism. I mean, Freudianism is garbage, but the faculty psychology viewpoint actually had and has some merit. Whoever the subject matter or the population under discussion and research. Cleckley's big critique of faculty psychology, which is now known as modularity of mind generally. That perspective argues that things like intelligence and moral consciousness and emotions, these aren't separate parts of the brain, but are really just, the way diagnosticians conceptualize things, owing to an inability to truly identify what the experience of consciousness is, okay? This gets a little bit abstract, but basically, Cleckley wasn't rejecting this outright in all circumstances, but he was saying, as applied to the psychopath, it's particularly misguided. And beyond that, attempting to understand the human mind as not truly monadic, but a sort of aggregation of discrete components that reflect individuated functions. The way one might look at the digestive of the circulatory system is particularly misguided. And Cleckley also, and I find this interesting, considering he was writing in the 1940s, he said that there's and I do agree with this qualifiably, his sociological critique of then modern life, he said that modern life doesn't serve human needs, so it gives rise to a counterculture tendency, even within people who aren't necessarily prone to oppositional defiance. And he said that what this does is that it generates a romanticized anti-hero archetype in the public mind. And coupled with the deterioration of empathy, owing to the pace and character and dysfunction of modern living, this feeds predatory instincts and psychosexual pathology in a kind of perfect storm of anti-hero longing for how to structure the self, in absence of other meaningful identitarian criteria that one can take on. So the war of all against all becomes a hedonic sort of hunt of every man seeking prey for hedonic gratification. In figurative terms, this is lauded in a high-tech and hyper-competitive sociological structure, but it then becomes quite literal. And I don't think that's entirely wrong. Okay? But when people like Richard Ramirez and people like Ted Bundy and people like John Wayne Gacy and people like Edmund Kemper, all these men are quite different in their discrete fascinations and individual personality traits, but one thing that they had in common is none of them reflected this diagnostic model that Cleckley suggested, is what constitutes the psychopathic personality. So even law enforcement agencies and academics and people who were prone to devising predictive models of behavior in abnormal subjects, human subjects, they came to realize this was somewhat uncharted territory. And one thing that's interesting to me, and I've made the point in this series and other places, in no uncertain terms, I consider behavioral science, as it's practiced by law enforcement, to mostly be abject nonsense. And in particular, John Douglas is an out-and-out charlatan and just kind of a ridiculous human being, and not in a cool way. He's ridiculous in an uncool way. But, at Quantico, this predictive behavioral psychology division of the FBI, it came about in part because of Ramirez's murder spree, and it very much took occult motivations seriously. Now that's not to say that the FBI or law enforcement agencies at any level, including the top of the profession, as it were, that's not to say that they have any sort of enlightened perspective on human psychology. But one thing they're not is they're not a bunch of yokels listening to Bob Larson and trying to cast demons out by handling snakes and things. Okay, they took occult motivations very seriously, so much so that they began training members of their behavioral science team as experts in occult motivations for violent crime. They started researching the incidence of atavistic religious practices, things like cannibalism, things like human sacrifice, things, belief in demonic possession, and they started trying to code variables that would predict where and how and why these things would emerge in otherwise modern societies that had a rationalist perspective on the sources of human behavior and illness, mental and physical, and natural phenomena and things, because they realized that people like Richard Ramirez weren't acting in isolation. They were partaking of either a mass psychological delusion, or there was something in modern life that was encouraging regressive behaviors whereby people were responding to triggers, overt or implied, in their environment and reverting to a kind of barbarism sight unseen really in the modern era, other than in cases of abject lunatics who were barely functional. But that's not the kinds of people we're talking about here. And incidentally, this was the source of concern about subliminal messages. Okay. Now, obviously, speaking of Bob Larson, there was nutty people like Wally George and Bob Larson. There was plaintiffs' attorneys who were looking to carve out an entire new practice area whereby great profits could be realized if liability could be demonstrated, by suggesting that heavy metal music or horror movies was programming people to commit suicide or self-harm or commit violent acts. And it became a farce. But initially, research into this subject matter was anything but farcical. And the idea that symbolic psychology can impact human behavior in a triggering capacity that's very subliminal and subconscious, that's not silly. That's a very real thing. Carl Jung, in his last years, he was researching tarot cards a lot. That's why if you read Dune, a lot of people, they don't understand, especially young bloods, but even a lot of people my age, especially in Dune, Messiah and Children of Dune, a plot device is that there's a tarot deck modeled off of aspects of the planet Arrakis. And people who have the gift of prescience to varying degrees, they've started making use of this tarot deck to try and divinate future events. And that was a Jungian thing. Not because Jung thought you should sit down and look at tarot cards and it'll tell you, how to bet at the horse track, or whether or not, a girl's going to go out with you, or whether or not, you got cancer or whatever. But Jung's idea was that the human mind and subconscious capacities is constantly both interpreting prime psychological symbols in that environment, but also introducing symbols that emerge from the subconscious. They're presumably epigenetically inherited into the environment, and people who are both perceiving these things and introducing these things in a kind of feedback loop, they don't even realize they're doing it. So Jung's notion was that, well, if you're dealing cards either in a game with other people, or if you're, drawing a tarot deck in a solitary capacity, you probably don't realize it, but you're subconsciously memorizing the order of those cards, and your mind is coming back again and again to certain patterns, owing to some significance of the symbols represented on the face cards or the paints, or owing to some numeric sequence on the number cards. And if you can become aware of that, and if you can become aware of why your subconscious mind is attracted to these things, well, you can come to understand certain things in your immediate environment that you weren't consciously aware of, but that probably have a tendency towards what we view as, an almost prescient understanding of temporal events, and that's serious stuff, even if it is highly esoteric. So the subliminal messaging thing initially derived from that same sort of school of thought, okay? And taken in context, and again, I'm not suggesting there weren't nutty people who had crazy ideas about this, or cynical people who were trying to exploit this for various reasons. But in context, and I lived through this as an adolescent, and it was a real thing. There's this outbreak of apparently random homicide, and this bizarre incidence of, a subset of that population that's doing these things that apparently believes that they're familiars of supernatural beings or demonic entities. And within the environment, it stands to reason that something is probably triggering or at least contributing to these behavior patterns. Okay? So it's not totally far off, especially, if you're looking at these things that keep recurring in the culture, especially but not exclusively in metal records and horror movies. It's not totally outlandish to suggest that maybe the triggering mechanism is contained within these things. And again, initially nobody was even suggesting this was entirely intentional, but understanding what that process entails, it's not just a matter of sating curiosity or, acquiring closure amidst tragedy, where, you know, some poor kid or some poor woman is brutalized and butchered. But there was a real risk, as it appeared, of serial murder becoming a genuine epidemic. If these things are true, what I just suggested, and what some of these researchers were suggesting, this potentially could be a real problem. Because if that's something that's happening, what's to stop, you know, okay, maybe at peak there was 3,000 serial killers in the United States. Well, what if suddenly there's 80,000? You know, what if suddenly guys don't know why, but they start having sexually violent thoughts about, like, their wives and daughters or something? You know,
I mean, like, you can imagine it if, like, a comparable, you know, quote unquote mental health crisis, if, you know, instead of depression or anxiety, you know, your coworkers and, you know, the people you encounter in your daily life ran around with axes killing people.
Yeah.
It would be a negative outcome.
No, and no, 100%. And something, the data, anecdotal as it was, and the samples being skewed as they were, to bring it back to, say, for example, the zebra killings. Okay, these guys, like, a lot of those guys were kind of losers who had petty criminal records, but these guys didn't have a history of outrageous violence or something. You know, it's like something had come over them. You know, and this one, the guy who turned state's evidence, he was genuinely frightened, and he said before he knew it, this was just out of control, and he's like, they couldn't stop. And for some reason, he wasn't impacted that way. You know, but the guys who, another truly horrible case, I'm perfectly willing to cover it because it's relevant to the subject matter, but the case of the Chicago Ripper crew, I find it unpleasant to discuss that case because it's so disgusting. It's like viscerally disgusting and just evil. But, you know, Robin Gecht, who obviously was a serious deviant, you know, it'd be one thing if he'd done these things himself, but he had at least 3 accomplices who, again, had no history of sexual violence, who were doing unbelievably horrific things. They were doing necrophilic and cannibalistic things. It's like they went collectively insane, you know, and they can't be chalked up to what is conventional sociological musings about criminal personalities and their tendency to abide a group consensus, particularly, you know, when somebody they look to as a leader element is capable of extreme violence. It, you know, so this was a real concern, you know, and it, you know, it was frightening, you know. It a lot of the films from the era too, other than Rocky IV, I mean, this can seem really silly, but my favorite Stallone movie is Cobra, because it's by George P. Cosmatos, and it's a proper horror movie. And it's about this cult led by Brian Thompson, and that's exactly the subject matter, is they undertake this campaign of mass homicide, incident to this kind of helter-skelter ideology, but it's basically the driving element of the plot is that some sort of mass hysteria is causing otherwise ordinary people to develop homicidal ideation and then ultimately to act upon it. And there's this whole montage scene where they show this one guy, he like works in a fishery because like all the people in this cult, they get this tattoo. And so like this dude's like cutting up fish and like he's one of them. This lady who's a cop, like she's one of them. This kind of like nebbish accountant guy, like he's one of them. And I mean, yeah, that's a silly movie. I'm not saying that you should watch that movie and and derive some sort of enlightened perspective from it, but that was in the zeitgeist because of the things I'm talking about. You know, that's why something like that doesn't really have a context today. it just seems like stupid or weird or like some kind of tawdry fantasy piece. But it so the reason why I spun off to talk about this, I mean, not just because it sets the zeitgeist of and the psychological environment of Richard Ramirez was mired in, but also, again, I'm constantly coming up against people, academics, not just guys on the internet with podcasts, and they're pushing back on me as the Satanic Panic was curated by Geraldo and these bumpkins in the Bible Belt who couldn't handle the disruptions of modern life. That's not what happened. Again, there obviously there were yahoos who profited from this, like Bob Larson, but that wasn't what it was emergent from. And even these behavioral science types at Quantico, everybody, like normies, all like respect these guys and act like they've got great insight into the human condition. It's like, well, these guys were basically driving this research, so it's an odd it's an odd kind of a blind spot. Let me find a place in my and it's also an interesting guy who wrote, I mean, he's interesting anyway, but he wrote a lot about Ramirez before Ramirez was identified, and then after Ramirez was arrested, and I think he even continued interviewing him after Ramirez was convicted and was on San Quentin death row. But this guy, Dr. Martin Blinder, he came to prominence because he was an expert witness at the murder trial of Dan White. And Dan White was the dude who blew away Harvey Milk and George Moscone. I don't think either of those were any big loss. Should be told. But Blinder was he became something of he was kind of like Park Dietz, okay? And Park Dietz put himself on the map because he was a witness for the prosecution in the Hinckley trial. But Blinder, I think Blinder's research was and is quite a bit more rigorous than Dietz. Dietz is kind of a celebrity witness more than he is a real researcher, in my opinion. But Blinder was consulted by LA County Sheriff's Homicide when it became clear they had a serial killer on their hands, and he made the point that hot prowling homes and then assaulting and torturing the victims the way that the Night Stalker did, and indulging this gratuitous violence that suggests a delight in the suffering and pain of others above and beyond, even that which is common to an aroused sexual sadist. Blinder speculated this is so unusual, and because the victim profile was all over the board, but there was a disproportionate number of Asian women, Blinder speculated that it may very well have been a Special Operations Forces veteran of Vietnam who was mired in some kind of flashback episodes because it was so strange and so basically unprecedented, and there was all kinds of the nature of combat in Vietnam was leading to strange outcomes too in terms of the lasting impact, which is what Blinder was getting at. This catch-all term PTSD is problematic for a lot of reasons. I hear people refer to it, and I'll bring it back in a second, but this is important. I heard people suggest that shell shock was a euphemism for it. It's not. There's a particular kind of injury to the central nervous system if you're under constant artillery barrage. That's different.
I mean, not to get this off track, but the TBI, traumatic brain injuries, like you see the same thing obviously with guys under bombardment, but also, speculation has run wild that professional wrestler Chris Benoit, was affected by this. Obviously, any number of professional athletes. Aaron Hernandez is kind of the the prototypical example, but
Junior Seau,
and it's difficult because there is often overlap. Generally, if you were being shelled, there's probably some other traumatic experience you went through, to put it mildly. But I just wanted to echo that point that those are not generally seen as synonymous.
Oh no, you're right. Yeah, that's 100% true. And also in Nam, this plays into the pathology of Ramirez's cousin Mike, who was a special forces operator in Vietnam. In Nam, air mobility totally changed the battlefield. Air mobility changed combat, I think, probably even more than locally autonomous drones are, because air mobility meant you could force enemy contact. It totally changed the dynamics of combined arms for all time. So if you were in the infantry in Nam, you were intrinsically air mobile, even if you weren't so designated. So over and over and over again, you were having contact with the enemy, and that coupled with concussion injuries and other things, that creates kind of a perfect storm potentially of pathologies, and people are so afflicted like that. It's not their fault. I'm not trying to be punitive. I've actually got a lot of sympathy for guys who got banged up in Vietnam. But it was Blinder. I mean, his research in that regard is interesting on its own terms, but the point being, these cases that kept happening, and California, Northern California and Southern California both, the incidence of these things was becoming so commonplace. It boggled the mind. Anecdotally, the Larry Bittaker and Roy Norris, they were this they murdered teenage girls, and at the same time they were doing that, like Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Bono, the Hillside Stranglers, they were doing exactly the same thing. And these guys were, even without even being aware of each other, they were using some of the same dump sites. Like that. That's totally insane. This was just something, this was becoming so common. You'd have guys kind of like passing in the night who were doing the same thing, and even utilizing dump sites in common in the foothills, because if you know the fire roads in Southern California, it'll be at least a few days before law enforcement finds a body. And this was before there was advanced DNA testing. By that point, animal predation and the sun and everything else will take care of the evidence. But that just gives you an idea of how insanely common this was. And around the same time, William Bonin and a couple of his Bonin was gay, and a couple of his like cruising buddies, they were like slaughtering male hitchhikers. Somebody I can't remember who it was. One of these Joseph Wamba type kind of hard-boiled cop authors. He referred to the highways of Southern California in the 70s and 80s as a killing field. And that's not just hyperbole. Like the body count is completely insane. And that's why hitchhiking stopped being a thing. Is because of that experience. I mean, to this day, like nobody hitchhikes, even with GPS and cell phones and the ubiquity of the electric eye. It's become like hard.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's one of those things where it was like once the degree of social trust necessary for that system to function went away. And look, like there was always potential for abuse. Like even in was it? I think it's the first major Flannery O'Connor novel. There's a hitchhiking, or actually this features often in her books. I don't know why. Good Man is Hard to Find in Others, right? Written, set during the 20s and 30s.
Right.
There were cases where, you picked up an axe murderer. It happens.
And also,
But,
women always had to be careful, I'm sure, of guys getting, a little bit too aggressive with stuff. And yeah.
Well, of course. But I mean, to your point, the reason I brought it up is that there's an order of magnitude difference between that and particularly, the highways of, as you said, Southern California.
Yeah. Guys just hunting humans, for sport. No, the whole, excuse me. So yeah, this was, and this is one of the reasons, because people have raised the issue about Ramirez as they did, about Son of Sam. It's like, okay, there's a city of millions of people. What are the odds of getting murdered by a home invader? It's like, well, better than you think, honestly. But also, it wasn't just about Richard Ramirez. It wasn't just about the Son of Sam. This was a pattern of behavior that was cropping up again and again at increasing scale. It wasn't just one isolated incident. That's there's a lot of weird stuff that goes into the kind of subculture of Jack the Ripper researchers, which I find kind of off-putting, but I got interested in it owing to this subject matter, but also George Bernard Shaw, who was an interesting guy. I admit I got a soft spot for not just some of his plays, but some of his socio-political musings. But it's pretty clear to me that Jack the Ripper wasn't one guy. It was a number of guys who were doing this for sport. And that's why Scotland Yard is gravely concerned. And George Bernard Shaw, the Nietzschean, he famously said that Jack the Ripper, whoever he is like doing a great service, and he's like a good progressive because he's alleviating suffering by like butchering these wretches and like getting them out of our shit, which I think was a little bit too callous to probably be funny, and I'm somebody who appreciates gallows humor. But point being, Scotland Yard took it so seriously because I think they realized what I just said, that this isn't some lone maniac who's hearing voices. This is something that people are doing in a regular capacity, owing to some sort of triggering mechanism or tendency towards atavistic violence that, due to variables not yet identified, is causing this, and in late modernity, and particularly in highly scaled urban environments. And once that kind of thing develops a true spontaneous momentum, it simply can't be controlled any longer. And to bring it back to Blinder, he made the point too that law enforcement really got blindsided by this. He wrote a book, the title sounds goofy, but it's contextually relevant. He wrote a book called Lovers, Killers, Husbands, Wives. And it was a study, basically a homicide in the Western world in the modern era, in the traditional linear temporal paradigm, of modernity, following the Middle Ages and continuing to the then present mid-20th century. He pointed out that anybody who just murders strangers and on top of that, murders strangers without a profit motive, but who does it for a hedonic reason, this almost never happened. And then suddenly it started happening all the time. Traditionally a murderer is somebody who kills his wife or a romantic rival or a business rival or he murders somebody owing to reasons of masculine honor. Almost always it's men under 30 who would do this. Almost always was a one-off thing that, wouldn't occur again. And then very suddenly with the violence epidemic, all these assumptions ceased to exist, and the serial killer became a permanent fixture in the developed world, and it was, at the time, it was interesting. There's a fascinating film, back when back when HBO actually did worthwhile films. Imagine that. It was called Citizen X. It was about Andrei Chikatilo, who was a very prolific serial killer in the Soviet Union. And one of the reasons why the militia and KGB and GRU alike, they refused to acknowledge that serial murder existed in the Soviet Union, because they said, this is something that's emergent in late capitalist cultures that are failing. Even if superficially it appears that one man is doing these things, that's not what's happening. So Chikatilo, he got away with it for like 20 years. But the Blinder, when he was writing, he made the point it wasn't clear if there were serial killers behind the Iron Curtain, in comparable ratio and frequencies as in the West, obviously, because there was no access to data there, and the official line of these Marxist-Leninist states was that, this is a capitalist phenomena that doesn't exist here.
Well, and that adds an interesting dimension to the question of subliminal messaging. One would assume, if that were the sole cause in a similarly sized country, right, another superpower, absent those things, and obviously I understand there was cinema behind the Iron Curtain, but there's nowhere near the level of media, the same type of media we got in the West.
Right, and there was pornography, other than like underground stuff. Yeah. No, that's an important. I spend a lot of time trying to dig out what I can about the sociology within the Soviet Union and the satellite states. You can find a fair amount about East Germany. I mean, obviously, because there's not just the fact that, there was, they had a common language, and there was even during periods of heightened tension, like people over 65 were allowed to like travel to the West and even stay there if they wanted, because it's like they're retired people. So there was always cross-cultural exchange and stuff. But it's hard to find real data even today. I mean, part of that's because, in the case of the Russian Federation, they clamped down on people being able to access the archives and stuff. And it's not like this stuff's on like some, version of the cloud in Russia or something. You can just access it. But, data was so much manipulated, particularly anything relating to criminality or sociological aspects that, tended towards antisocial behavior. But it's, if I had the time, if I wasn't sort of so mired in the kinds of projects I am now, including this manuscript most immediately, but I mean, just generally, like my topical focus is political theory and stuff. If I had the time, I'd take on a project like that, because I think it is important. It's not just a matter of sating a macabre curiosity either. This pattern is going to emerge again, unfortunately. I mean, I have no idea what the cyclical coding is, but this didn't just happen once, and in the last 40,000 years, and it's never going to happen again. In fact, I think it may very well emerge even within my lifetime. And I find that unsettling. But moving it forward, to get these tangential discussions, I hope the subs don't find it to be undermining the core. I did a lot of research on this when I was on the road, actually, as you can probably tell, and I think it's important, and I think it's material. But to bring it back to the case of Ramirez in a more direct way.
There were two images that you sent me.
Yeah.
Do you want to mention
bring
those?
up. Yeah, that's Ramirez's AC/DC cap. And one of the first murders that facilitated the understanding that a serial murderer was active. Dale Okazaki, she was murdered. Her roommate survived because her keys deflected the round. Ramirez dropped, or he lost his AC/DC cap at the scene. And, because Ramirez loved rock and roll. Yeah, that's the actual cap. And the Avia shoe print and the AC/DC cap. Those are the first pieces of material evidence that Los Angeles Sheriff's Homicide got hold of. And, when it became clear Ramirez was a rock and roll fanatic, that obviously raised all kinds of concerns in the public mind, owing to what we were talking about at the top of the hour about subliminal coding within the culture tending to trigger psychological mechanisms that tended towards atavistic expressions of violence and sexual and sadistic and otherwise. So that became a big deal, and the song Night Prowler was one of Ramirez's favorite jams, and later he admitted that he considered that his song. That and Eyes Without a Face by Billy Idol. He loved Billy Idol too, which is interesting. I think Billy Idol's great, but Ramirez had more eclectic taste than your average metalhead. But he, disturbingly, and I don't want to upset people, but this is material for a few reasons. Post-mortem, Ramirez began removing victims' eyes that had a significance to him. And obviously the Billy Idol jam is based on the movie Eyes Without a Face. Ramirez had some understanding or belief, and this is one of those sort of cross-cultural belief structures about, the repository of the human soul and intellect and things. There's always an emphasis. There's an emphasis placed on eyes. As you can discern somebody's innermost confidences if you look them in the eye, or you can, discern their moral compass or something, or that's where the soul truly resides, in such that it's there's a corporeal aspect to it. So Ramirez had this idea that by taking people's eyes, he somehow was capturing their transcendental essence, which is kind of horrible to think about. But he was very aware that, symbolic phenomena in the environment was triggering thought patterns within his own waking consciousness, as well as his own, subliminal psychic experience. And I find that really interesting. I think Ramirez was a fascinating guy. I don't mean that in flattering terms. He was a horrible, horrible person, and he shouldn't be lauded in any way, shape, or form, obviously. But he had a lot of insight into what he was doing and why he was doing it. And frankly, most sexually violent men don't have that kind of insight, which is another reason why, not always, but often, the true serial killer is something of a man apart from, his peers, if you want to look at it like that, and who exist outside the law and whose stock and trade is violence. It's not accidental, and Ramirez wasn't the only one like that, but I think he was, if not the most erudite, kind of the most reflective on these things. And Sheriff Block, who was the sheriff of LA County, as I mentioned, he called a literal press conference when he decided that the public had to be advised of the fact that there was a threat of a serial murderer emergent, and a guy named Gil Carrillo. He's kind of he's still alive. He's kind of a fixture on these police and crime podcasts these days, I noticed. Carrillo wasn't the lead investigator on the case, but he had an outsized influence for two reasons. He was highly computer literate because he was like a young, techie, and that was rare, in 1984, 85, especially in, the sheriff's department. But also, he became something of an expert on occult influenced murders, and he actually liaised with Quantico at the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit because he was considered to be a man who had expertise and insight into occult crime. So again, this was coming from federal law enforcement as well as big city sheriff's departments like LA County Homicide. It wasn't simply being driven by media or by Al Gore's wife or by moral majority holy rollers, and that really can't be overstated because the narrative doesn't abide that reality. But that's about all I got on this subject.
One thing I wanted to say, this is sort of a capstone. We got a number of questions about one of the sources we mentioned in our first Richard Ramirez episode. The name of the guy we're talking about is Nicholas Schreck. That's Nikolas Schreck. He married LaVey's daughter. He's sort of an interesting character. I believe got one of his ears cut off by a group of gay prostitutes. Weird story that is on his Wikipedia page. But he, in addition to corresponding with Ramirez, and he's sort of on the podcast circuit, but he was also in touch with and sort of obsessed with Manson as well. Take this guy's testimony for what you will. In addition to being connected to, LaVey, he was involved with the Temple of Set, other organizations. But he does, he did have firsthand contact with many of these guys. So that's the source that Thomas and I are pulling from for at least part of this. People were asking, so that's where you can find that. But yeah, Thomas, thank you so much. This was really, really educational, interesting. Obviously, we will keep going in the occultism series. As far as your stuff, not much has changed since the last episode. I think everyone is eagerly awaiting your book, but I'll be sure to link to your Substack. The Gumroad, where you and I release our current events show, as well as your website. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Like I said before, this is what I do. I appreciate your support. I can't do it without you. And if you think it's worth your money, throw me a few bucks on Patreon, on Substack, or Gumroad. And in addition to helping me keep the lights on, guess what? You get the episodes early and ad-free. Anything else, Thomas?
No, I think that's it, man. Thanks so much for hosting me, man.
Oh, and one other thing, I want to give a special shout out to JD at Axios Remote Fitness Coaching, because I can't walk today because he decided that this was a split squat kind of day. I'm hobbling around like I'm I'm fucking 85. But again, Thomas, this was great. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.